Hello everyone! Today, we will be exploring the 12 principles of multimedia learning developed by Richard Mayer. These principles are based on how our brains process information, and these 12 principles also provide a practical framework for designing instructional content that is clear, engaging, and effective.
Let's talk about how to make multimedia learning more effective by reducing extraneous processing. Firstly, extraneous processing happens when learners spend mental effort on irrelevant or poorly designed material like unnecessary graphics, texts, or sounds. This can lead to extraneous processing overload, where the distractions overwhelm working memory, leaving little room for understanding the actual lesson. The culprit is the extraneous material, which are elements like decorative images, background music, or redundant text that don't serve its intended purpose.
To avoid this, Richard Mayer developed 5 principles for reducing extraneous processing. The first is the coherence principle, which is the removal of irrelevant words, pictures, sounds, or music from the lesson, keeping it simple and focused. The second is the signaling principle, which is the use of cues like arrows or highlights to direct attention to key information to help learners focus on what is important.
The third principle is the redundancy principle, the avoidance of presenting the same information in multiple formats at the same time, like text and audio together, for example. Stick to only one format for presenting the critical information. The fourth principle is the spatial contiguity principle, which is placing related text and graphics close together so learners don't waste time scanning back and forth. The last principle is the temporal contiguity principle, which should show corresponding visuals and audio at the same time rather than one after the other, which helps learners process them together more effectively.
This next topic is all about Richard Mayer's principles for managing essential processing in multimedia learning. We will be explaining and applying the concept of the 3 key principles for effective learning design, which are the segmenting principle, the pre-training principle, and the modality principle. Firstly, the segmenting principle suggests that presenting complex information in smaller, manageable parts or segments enhances learning effectiveness. So, in order for the learners to process information much more easily, educators should break it down into a simpler form. Yet, the essence of the topic is still there, instead of giving them information overload. This principle also emphasizes learner control over their pace, allowing them to process each segment before continuing. To apply the segmenting principle, organize your content into manageable, coherent chunks. Ensure that each lesson, module, or slide focuses on a limited amount of information. Provide learners with the ability to control their progression through the material, such as using next buttons or allowing them to adjust the playback speed of audio or video. Moving on, the pre-training principle states that learners understand new information better when they have prior knowledge of the essential concepts, terms, or basic skills related to the topic. This principle highlights the importance of preparing learners in understanding a new lesson by giving them a simple definition and an overview of key concepts regarding the topic before giving them a complicated task or activity.
To apply the pre-training principle, learners should familiarize themselves with key concepts, terms, and characteristics of the main concepts. Once they are familiar with it, the next step is to delve into the basic building of components and understand each term and purpose as practice. Lastly, the learners practice building the main model, applying what they have learned in the first steps of pre-training work. Now, let's talk about the modality principle. This principle uses pictures and spoken words to deliver engaging lessons to the learners. This is also called the modality of loading, which means words are presented as a narration rather than a simple on-screen text. This leads to a better modality effect as combination of visual and auditory presentation can lead to a better result called temporal contiguity effect. To apply the modality principle, information is divided into 2 aspects, visual and auditory. 2 delivery channels are used to deliver topics to the learners. Pictures are presented visually and words and text are narrated or converted to audio recording. These are combined to create an engaging information delivery to the learners. The modality principle helps to reduce the cognitive load of the learners in terms of processing information.
Now, let's dive into the 4 principles for fostering generative processing. It simply means that multimedia learning is all about helping learners actively make sense of the material, not just by receiving information, but engaging with it meaningfully. It is more about designing multimedia that will aid learners to understand, engage, and remember the information better. The first principle is the personalization principle. This suggests that when the content is presented in a conversational or friendly tone, rather than a formal one, it makes the material feel more engaging and relatable. The principle is all about using a conversational tone to make learning feel more personal, like someone's actually talking to you. This kind of connection helps you stay engaged and understand the material better. Another one is the voice principle. It is where we use a human voice for narration instead of a robotic or a synthetic one to increase the learner's connection. An example of this is when we use a natural or a person's voice, which helps learners feel more connected to the content. That's because hearing a real human voice makes it feels like someone is actually there talking to you, which helps you stay more engaged and interested to learn better.
Another way to foster generative processing is using multimedia to present words and pictures together, which is more effective than using words alone. When learners see both words and pictures in a presentation, it helps them create and visualize mental images and concepts. This process enables them to build connection between what they hear and what they see, which enhances their understanding. A great example of this is what we experienced during our early days in math, concerning fractions. A lot of us probably saw pizzas or pies being used as diagrams and how they're being divided into parts alongside its explanations. Seeing fraction visually makes it easier for us to understand its purpose, such as how its parts relate to a whole. Moving on to the last principle. It questions whether putting the speaker's image on screen during learning or presentation helps to foster generative processing. The image principle explores the effect of learning while seeing a floating head talking on the presentation or an avatar speaking beside the information being presented to learners. However, after a few tests, it appears that this kind of learning might be situational. For example, it has been suggested that this approach could be effective if the agent or avatar on screen serves as a guide, directing the learner's attention to specific parts of the presentation by pointing them out. It's important to note that more research is needed to determine the full range of effective uses for this method of learning.
Now let's dive into Richard Mayer theory, the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. But before that, let's discuss the theories behind it. The cognitive load theory or CLT by John Sweller and the dual coding theory or DCT by Alan Pavillo. CLT explains how our working memory has a limited capacity. It identifies intrinsic load, the natural complexity of the content. Next is extraneous load, the distraction that interfere with learning. And lastly, germane load, mental efforts that helps process and organize knowledge. DCT, on the other hand, proposes that we learn through 2 different channels, the verbal or logogens and visual, the imagens. While these work separately, they can interact to boost memory retention when activated together. With this foundation, Mayer developed CTML, which include 2 key assumptions. One is active processing assumption. Material should be engaging and effectively encourage and guide students to create mental models. Second is limited capacity assumption. Each channel can only handle a limited amount of information at a time. CTML suggests that when learners are presented words and pictures, these are processed in their respective channels. Then the brain organizes, selects, and integrates the new information with prior knowledge, enabling deeper learning and long-term memory storage. Mayer emphasizes that good multimedia design isn't just about integration of mediums, but it's about reducing cognitive overload and promoting active learning processing. For example, using concise text, clear visuals, and guided narration can help learners to focus and engage without being overwhelmed with the new information.